Welcome to the Unfettered Wealth Podcast with Tashlein from Connecticut Capital. In this podcast, we help business owners and successful professionals plan for better wealth outcomes. Join us for this journey where we explore ways to help you identify better wealth decisions to help you achieve an unfettered life. It's time to ask yourself, what do you want more of?
Hello and welcome to Unfettered Wealth with Tashlein. Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Good morning, Eric. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic. It is Friday. The day we're meeting is Friday. I'm looking forward to the weekend. And I know that we have a guest on the show today, right?
We do. I've brought on Eugene Torrenti, primarily because, well, one, he's a great guy, but two, all of my clients seem to, just struggle when it comes to understanding estate planning. So I thought he'd be a good guest today.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Gene, I'm so excited to have you on the show because estate planning is incredibly important. And Eric and I have talked about that a little bit before, but now he's brought on the pro. Welcome to the show.
Thank you both for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure, Gene. Hey, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to give our audience just a little bit of your background before we get into some of the Q&A, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Gene practices in the areas of estate planning, estate and trust administration, taxation, business law, real estate, and eldercare planning. His business law practice includes representing closely held businesses, LLCs, nonprofits, and so forth. From an individual standpoint, he helps families to make sure that they have a tax-efficient estate, that they're on top of their gift and charitable planning as well. Gene went to some great schools. He graduated magna cum laude from University of Pennsylvania. He received his JD from Vanderbilt University. And while at Vanderbilt, he was actually the authorities editor of the Vanderbilt Journal of Transactional Law and received the American Jurisprudence Award in Labor Relations. He received his LLM in tax from Boston University. And Gene, if you might notice, I'm not saying the years, right? Because we're both starting to get up there.
That's much appreciated, Eric. Thank you.
And he's been a lecturer in front of many civic organizations and has helped out throughout the community. So good morning, Gene. How you doing?
Good morning. Thanks again for having me on, Eric.
Of course. So listen, I've spent time with you. I know you have a keen mind. You probably could have done anything in terms of a career. Why did you choose to practice law?
I think I chose it more than anything because of the breadth of areas that it gave me a chance to go into. And I wasn't entirely sure what area. I had an idea when I was in law school, but as my career has unwound, I can see why I chose something so broad, because my career has spanned from a large corporate firm in Pittsburgh doing commercial litigation to smaller firms back here where I grew up in Connecticut, where I started doing transactional work and eventually evolved into doing more and more tax work to the point where getting my tax degree in the late 80s seemed like a good thing to do. So the progression of my career underscores, I think, why I was drawn to the law in the first place. It seems to transcend all areas, and I think I've hit a fair number of them along the way. So.
Oh, that's great. That always keeps it interesting for sure. So I always find, I'm sure you do too, initially when folks come in, that, estate planning, there's always some mystery to it. Folks are always unsure about how to go about, creating wills and trusts, and they're not always sure, should they have both. But before we get into some of the basic end of things, I know that you do work with business owners and, you've helped them with business sale. I know you work with some very successful individuals as well. Gene, would you mind just maybe speaking to the listeners about maybe a sample or an example of a business sale and how you incorporated proper estate planning with that situation?
Sure. Well, in the some of the more successful scenarios, what we have tended to do is look at trying to leverage as much of the value of the business out of the estate tax system. So where, for instance, you have a good candidate for business succession, such as a second generation person, we have implemented certain vehicles such as trusts, where there can be sales to those trusts, oftentimes and usually for discounted values. And there's just a lot of leveraging that goes into all that, which is more detail than we can probably go into for this discussion. But it would be those kinds of transactions really where we're really able to avoid legitimately a lot of estate tax ramifications, but move wealth from one generation to the next.
So when it comes to business sales, obviously there's a lot of nuances, and from what you've told me in the past and having seen you in action, there's a lot of Q&A that's part of that. So when you're sitting down with an owner initially, and they're maybe they're in their 60s and they're thinking about their next lives, what are some of the questions that you take them through just to try to gain some clarity in those areas?
Believe it or not, Eric, we often start more from the psychological aspect than anything. I think for a lot of people, even though you're selling for what often seems like a handsome amount, I think you can't really underestimate the magnitude of the transition and adjustment that business owners have to make. And those who are very successful very often are people who spent an awful lot of time on that job. And there are people that I think have to plan adequately ahead first in their mind about what they would do. And I think those kinds of issues are usually mitigated in large part by the way we negotiate in transition periods for somebody after they sell a business. So on the one hand, that's a great way to get a higher purchase price, because the fact that the owner is going to stay around for a little longer certainly gives the buyer a greater feel that he or she is getting the benefit of the bargain.
Sure.
Beyond that, though, I think it's as favorable for the seller, because the seller doesn't have such a drastic adjustment to make and stays in the business for a set period of time. It could be 2 years, it could be 5 or more, and it allows that person to sort of drift out on a more gradual, manageable basis.
No, that's great. So, I've seen a lot of owners, retain some equity in the business too. So I think from that standpoint, it's a nice way to, if they're going to commit to 2 or 3 years, at least hopefully to be able to benefit from that. So I think I agree with you. It's definitely a win-win. So in terms of individuals, so if you're working with somebody that's worth over $5 million, what are some of the questions that you go through with them as well in terms of their lives and family and so forth?
Well, I think first of all, certainly the family structure is a very important threshold question. Then it goes to who the children are, if any, how many, and what their ability is really to manage wealth. Now, in most cases, even when you have a great ability to manage wealth, we find that the use of trusts is very favorable and advantageous, because you are able to kind of suspend the triggering of estate tax by doing that. So, as you know, Eric, we have all of our exemptions to use in the first instance when, let's say, a husband and or a wife pass away. But beyond that, the use of money suspended in trusts and assets does a lot to keep those assets from hitting the estate tax radar screen going into the future. So it is both an estate tax sheltering advantage, but also a creditor protection one as well.
Sure. No, that's awesome. I seem to run into a lot of people that have special properties, whether it's a family lake house or a ski house up north. And I know you've run into that. I would love for you to share with the listeners some things that they can think about if they'd like to keep this house within the family for, 50 or 100 years, for an example.
Sure. One very basic way to do it would often be to transfer it into an LLC and break the ownership of it into ownership chunks, such as LLC member interests. Some of the more aggressive and advantageous tax leveraging we've done, though, I can think of one offhand where a widow, perhaps in her early 70s, had a property on Martha's Vineyard that had appreciated greatly, and for which the real estate taxes were becoming a potential problem for her 4 or 5 children. And in that case, we used a qualified personal residence trust, which did a couple things. Number one, it allowed her to suspend relinquishing her use of the property. So in her case, I think we picked a 12-year income term. And by picking a longer income term, what we were allowed to do was get a sharper discount in the value of the property for gift tax purposes. At the end of the 12 years, when the property had appreciated even more, the property left her taxable estate. And by outliving the term, which is one of the requirements of a QPRT, she was able to both leverage the property out of her estate, save her children a very substantial Massachusetts estate tax, which was a key ingredient of the whole formula here, and also push it into continuing trusts that were creditor protected and estate tax sheltered in the children's estates. So on 3 or 4 different levels, that was a great vehicle and a great choice for that particular client.
No, that's a great example. Thank you. It's hard because you do see those children at times get involved with litigation or bankruptcy or divorce. And I think for the older clients, that they're looking for peace of mind, and I think that goes a long way to help with that for sure.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So when it comes to I run into things all the time in my practice, and I'd like to ask you in terms of when somebody's coming into your office, you must see some larger or just estate planning mistakes, commonly. Gene, what are some of the things that you see regularly that people should probably think to address?
Well, I think a lot of it is that people just don't get to it as soon as they need to. So I think, it goes back to really the most basic things. If you look at something like even a simple will, and I don't know what the statistic is currently. I think it's something like 70% of the population does not have any estate planning at all, which would suggest not even a simple will. But if you even look at a simple will, that does several things that are significant, whether you're high or low net worth. For instance, it would save you the probate bond cost, because one of the first things that a well-drafted will does is waive bond. Now, you can get that waived by motion to the court, but honestly, that's an extra step that you can easily avoid. A second thing that wills do that many people may overlook is that they allow you to determine who's going to be in charge of administering your estate. And although a lot of that's administrative, very often people, even who are family members and beneficiaries, may not be the best people to choose for that. So that's a second place where I think people maybe overlook some possibly unforeseen problems. And then the third one is that by not having even a simple will, you often leave things to the whims of the intestate or succession tax system in your state. And what a lot of people don't realize is that those provisions aren't always at all in accord with what you would want to see happen with your assets. And a really quick example of that would be Connecticut. If you have a husband and a wife with 2 small children, and one of those parents passes, the property doesn't pass just to the spouse. It passes 1/2 to the spouse after the first $100,000, and then 1/2 to the minor children. So most people can imagine what a problem that could cause. So in probate, you're talking about appointments of guardians ad litem and other things. And beyond that, in most cases, that just wouldn't be the decedent's wish if they had the choice. So I'd say overlooking some of those basic things before you even get into the subjects of different kinds of trusts, Eric, are things that people need to understand and appreciate.
Yeah, no, for sure. I know, it seems like the kids sometimes bring in some challenges, right? And what are some of the other errors that you see when it comes to having children named within the will or trust? What are some of the other issues that you tend to see?
Well, I think the very frequent use of triggering ages can be a problem. It's very common to see a will that says upon, say, age 25 or 30, my child gets half of their trust, and at 35, they might get the remainder. And, because I am 62 and I'll disclose that, I have to honestly say that my thinking about what a safe age has evolved somewhat radically. Because if you look at just the divorce rate alone, you can see that spans a pretty wide range of ages. So I'm, for instance, not a big fan of triggering ages because I'm just not sure what that safe age is anymore.
Sure.
And I think
No,
it's very important to look at things like suspending assets in a more open-ended way because the future's, a little uncertain for most of us.
Yeah, and there's always that one child, right? And in every family that presents challenges for everybody, and it's hard. And I've heard trust within the younger generations referred to as distrust. They're like, well, they're not leaving things outright to me, but there's a balance in there somewhere, right, Gene? In terms of finding a medium where you can maybe address some of those problem child's issues and at the same time not restrict all assets.
So I think with the use of the trust, the children just need to understand that if a trust is drafted flexibly, that really anything can happen. And in many cases, trusts do not even stay in existence for an extended period, but in others they are. And in very many cases, it has nothing to do with the distrust of the child. It has more to do really with the estate tax sheltering that I mentioned earlier.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I received a call earlier in the week from a gentleman, and it's very common. He's like, should I just have a will? Do I need some trust? So I know you had mentioned to me recently, there's some reasons where you'd have revocable trust, and if you would share that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So when we talk about a revocable trust, we're talking about the contrast between that and a testamentary trust. So this is a standalone trust, typically into which a will pours over. So anything not already in the trust as of the person's death gets transferred into the trust by way of the will. So some of the more prominent advantages of that are it gives greater privacy in the administration of the estate. And in this case, it gets a little technical, but frankly, it has to do with how much disclosure needs to be made of assets. So although all assets in a revocable trust are taxable, the amount of public disclosure on certain probate forms is less. So privacy is certainly one decided advantage. A second one is it streamlines the probate process generally because the fewer things you have to file and the fewer things you have to value, the greater the expedition through the probate process. For a lot of our clients, also, Eric, the ownership of out-of-state property becomes a great reason to establish a revocable trust because although we are typically all subject to probate in whatever state we own real estate in, having, for instance, your Florida property in your revocable trust, if you're a Connecticut resident, allows you to use a more streamlined administration process in Florida because of that trust.
No, that's great.
And
Thank
there's
you.
one other I'd like to add if I could, and that
Of
is
course.
that by having the revocable trust, what a lot of people tend to overlook is that you are allowing yourself to get out of the probate process as soon as the will gets fully administered. And by doing that, you are not subjecting the trust to continuing accountings by the probate court. And so when you consider the time and expense and just administrative burden of doing that, that really makes the revocable trust, in most cases, I think, a far more favorable alternative.
No, that's for sure. Having dealt with clients and in my own mom and dad, I think the goal of everybody is not to leave a mess, right? And then when there's when there's children and attorneys, doing all that finalization of estates and so forth. I think whatever you can do, to alleviate some of the stress and burden on the beneficiaries is really helpful. I mean, no matter what, the process, takes a while, especially in this environment. We're heading into the holidays here in 2020 with COVID and all. I'm sure that's delayed some estates being cleaned up from a court standpoint. But I think whatever you can do just to make lives easier for children that are often hurting or loved ones that are hurting afterwards is a positive thing.
Yes, I totally agree. And really, the more you can inject some certainty into the process and give people a little bit firmer roadmap as to where they're going, it's been my experience that just allays so many people's fears and anxieties that are unavoidable to some degree, but really don't need to be exacerbated by that additional uncertainty. So that's a very good point you make.
So if when you're out in the community, Gene, if you run into a business owner or entrepreneur and they're heading into a business sale or a large liquidity event, what would be a bit of advice that you would suggest to them?
Well, I think you always want to vet your buyer. And I think, but going back to my comment about the transition period, I think for a lot of business owners, it becomes important who they sell to from the standpoint of they may be living with that person for 2 to 5 years. So that's certainly one of them. And I think really beyond that, to the extent that we all have financial goals, I think you want to make sure you structure your transaction in a way that's really going to be tax effective. Certain, for instance, in a standard asset sale, there are different characterizations of monies coming as part of the sale process, some capital gains, some income, some amortizable, some not. So that makes up a good part of the negotiation issues between buyer and seller. And those are, I think, things that any seller should be mindful of going in.
Sure. And I've seen that before. I mean, the seller, of course, is looking for the best deal and certainly, the buyer as well. And I remember, an offer was made that would have turned what could have been a capital gain situation into a very high tax situation for the seller. And thankfully the tax attorney caught it and saved him a bundle of money. So it's just good to have teams, I think, working on your behalf. I think whenever I've been involved with sales and business planning, for sure, it's always nice to have an attorney and a CPA and advisors on board that can kind of meet on behalf of that client, for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
So in terms of you personally, I know you have some hobbies that you enjoy, and I've met your lovely bride. Would you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your family, your hobbies?
Sure. I'm married 22 years, no children. I live locally, actually, in the town that I grew up in. And as far as leisure, my wife and I enjoy some travel, a little bit less so under current circumstances, but we like to get away every October or so to a different spot. And other than that, I do enjoy a lot of golf, which is something I can enjoy rather efficiently because I play golf very close to home and in a place where I don't have to travel far. And it's something that I really enjoy doing with clients and friends, and something that really allows me to take the edge off. So other than some quick trips to the gym here and there, that really is what fills my downtime.
That's awesome. Is your game getting any better here over the years, or about the same?
I'd say it's leveling off because of the amount of commitment I've made to it, which is not always what I want it to be. So.
Sure. No, I really do enjoy playing golf. My wife actually loves playing golf, so I know I'm going to be committed over the next few decades here. I'm definitely a humbled golfer. How is your game these days when you go out and play? What was your handicap, Gene?
It's between a 10 and a 12 at any given time, and right now it's at the higher side of that. So, but it's really good. It's enough to have fun knocking it around. So.
Very cool. Very cool. Hopefully Santa brings you some new clubs this year.
Or at least some accessories, Eric.
Can never have enough accessories for golf.
That's right.
Sure. Or in my case, balls. You need lots of balls.
Right.
So in terms of things that you give away to friends to help improve their lives, or advice that you give, one question I always ask is, are there certain books that you've read that you love to give away to be helpful to people that you love in your life?
The one that was most striking that I read in the last 6 to 8 years that I recommend probably more frequently than any is Younger Next Year, which actually another friend of mine recommended when we were traveling and on a golf vacation. And I was quite enamored by it. And it was interestingly written by a doctor and a lawyer who met in a professional setting, and just they got into a study about what keeps people young, and how you can live into your not only 70s but 80s and even 90s and not really miss a beat. So I was quite taken by not only the science but sort of the sociology of that. So I would say that's probably the book I mention the most when it comes to recommending.
That's great. And I know that you heeded the advice of that book, 'cause I think you've dropped a few suit sizes over the last 5 years.
I dropped them, and I think I might have picked at least one up during the COVID crisis, Eric.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think after this year, we all look forward to hopefully, being a little younger next year after this, right?
Right, exactly.
So the name of the podcast is Unfettered Wealth, and that means different things for different people. For you or your clients, Gene, what does that bring to mind?
I think of three things when I hear that expression, and I think it depends on the individual. I think for some people, and probably most of my clients, what it means is the feeling that their children will be supported by some supplement to their lifestyle, and that when you make wealth unfettered by leaving it in ways that we've talked about on this podcast, that really enhances that. I think a second way is has to do a lot with creditor protection. Unfortunately, I think we live in a litigious age, and I think the thought that clients can leave assets, whether it be to children or other people, in ways that are more creditor protected is, in the truest sense of the word, unfettered, because it's beyond the reach of those kinds of threats. And I'd say the third one I think about is really just in a general sense, the freedom that wealth and expendable income gives all of us after we've worked for most of our lives, and believe it or not, I actually want to spend some of it. So it's really three different, to me, subsets and compartments, but those are the three that I tend to think about when I hear that phrase.
That's awesome, Gene. Thank you. So for listeners that recognize they need some estate planning, they have a will, it's covered in dust, they haven't looked at it in 20 years, or maybe they looked at it 5 years ago, but things have changed. What's the best way to reach you for estate planning work?
Well, certainly my website, which is www.torrentilaw.com, and we man the phones all the time, and we're very easily reached, and we try to make our process as seamless as possible. So if anybody even has some basic questions or would like things looked at, we're able to do that. And as a general rule, we schedule at least brief conference calls to go over preliminary goals to determine that what a client needs is something we can provide for them. And from there, we, like I said, we make our process about as seamless as we can, preparing documents, having meetings, whether that be Zoom or in person, and going through the process that way.
That's great, Gene. Thank you so much for coming on to the cast today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much for having me on.
Guys, this was fantastic. I mean, the importance of estate planning is obviously very, very clear. I love the comment about, Gene, I agree 100%, that we do live in a litigious society, and that would be the reason I don't play golf, or I'm very picky about the courses I go to. I want a course that has very little people, no houses around it, because, as you said, Eric, my investment for golf is more about the balls than it is the clubs. So I don't want to chance it. And if we do play golf together, just stand behind me. I usually don't hit it there. Okay? That's just my advice to you guys. Gene, again, thank you so much for your time today and all that you added to this podcast. Eric, thank you so much for bringing him on. Do you have any closing thoughts for today?
No, that's it. I really enjoyed this with Gene. I think everybody needs to update their estate planning, especially in this environment. And so I'm grateful, Gene, to have you on the cast. Thanks again.
It was a pleasure being here. Thanks again.
All right. And of course, the last thank you goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Unfettered Wealth Podcast with Eric Tashlein. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Eric comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. And think about this one specifically. Who do you know that maybe you guys have talked about in the past? Maybe you've talked about a little bit of planning for your kids or your grandkids, and you just don't know where they stand. Well, this would be the podcast to share, just so they have an idea of how important it is to make sure that they're covered. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at Connecticut Capital Management Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Unfettered Wealth Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Connecticut Capital. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. Content should not be construed as personalized investment, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your advisor, attorney, or tax advisor in regards to your individual situation. Eric Tashlein is an investment advisory representative of Connecticut Capital Management Group, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Connecticut Capital Management Group, LLC, and Connecticut Benefits Group, LLC are not affiliated.